The airport was loud that evening, but not in a chaotic way. It was a usual mix of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and quiet conversations between people who were either excited to leave or relieved to return home. The flight to the capital city was almost full. Business travelers in neat suits stood near the gate, checking their phones. Families sat together, guarding backpacks and snacks. A few college students leaned against the wall, laughing at something on a screen. Among them stood a man who carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. His suit was perfectly pressed, his watch expensive but not flashy, and his voice just loud enough for others to hear without him trying. He was a well-known CEO of a growing tech company. Many people at the gate recognized him. A few even whispered his name to each other. He seemed used to that kind of attention. In fact, he seemed to expect it. A few steps away sat another man, dressed simply in a plain jacket and dark jeans. His shoes were clean, but worn at the edges. He had a small carry-on bag at his feet and a paperback book in his hands. He did not look up much. He kept to himself, reading slowly, as if he had nowhere urgent to be. If someone looked at him, they would probably forget his face a few seconds later. He looked ordinary, calm, quiet. When boarding began, passengers lined up according to their groups. The CEO walked forward quickly when his group was called, stepping slightly ahead of others who had been waiting. A staff member politely reminded him about the order, but he smiled in a tight way and said something about having an important meeting in the morning. His tone wasn't angry. It was dismissive, like rules were flexible for people like him. The quiet man boarded later. He scanned his ticket and walked down the narrow aisle of the aircraft. The cabin lights were soft. The air smelled faintly of coffee and recycled air. He found his seat near the middle of the plane. He placed his bag overhead carefully, making sure it didn't hit anyone, then sat down and buckled his seatbelt. He looked out the window for a moment, watching ground staff move quickly beneath the wing. A few minutes later, the CEO approached the same row. He checked his boarding pass, frowned slightly, then looked at the quiet man. "I think you're in my seat," he said, though his voice already carried an edge. The quiet man checked his ticket calmly. "I'm in 14B," he replied in a steady tone. The CEO glanced at his own ticket. He was assigned 14C, the aisle seat. He sighed loudly. "I prefer aisle seats," he said, as if that explained everything. "This is the middle seat," the quiet man answered gently. "The aisle is yours." The CEO paused. For a moment, it seemed like he might let it go, but then he shook his head. "I don't do middle seats. I have work to do. I need space." He gestured toward the quiet man's small book as if it were proof of something lesser. Some of us have serious responsibilities. A few nearby passengers pretended not to listen, though their eyes flicked up from phones and magazines. The flight attendant stepped closer, sensing tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked politely. The CEO smiled at her, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I was just explaining that I need the aisle for work. Maybe he can switch with someone else." The quiet man looked at the flight attendant. "This is the seat on my ticket," he said softly. "But if someone else wants to trade, I don't mind." The CEO let out a short laugh. "That's the problem," he said. "People settle too easily. That's why they stay where they are." His words were not loud, but they were sharp, clear enough for the row behind them to hear. The quiet man didn't react. He simply nodded once and looked down at his hands. After a brief search, another passenger from the back agreed to switch seats with the CEO. The CEO thanked the passenger warmly, as if he had done him a favor, and moved away to his new aisle seat closer to the front. The quiet man remained where he was, now with an empty aisle seat beside him. As the plane finished boarding, a low hum filled the cabin. Overhead bins clicked shut. The safety demonstration began. The quiet man listened carefully, eyes forward. The CEO, now seated comfortably, opened his laptop before the plane even pushed back from the gate. During taxi, the CEO spoke loudly on his phone despite repeated reminders to switch to airplane mode. He discussed contracts, deadlines, and numbers that sounded large enough to impress anyone listening. Words like acquisition, expansion, and market dominance floated through the air. When the plane finally took off, the city lights grew smaller beneath them. The engines roared, then steadied into a constant vibration. Some passengers closed their eyes. Others relaxed once they were above the clouds. About 30 minutes into flight, beverage service began. The cart rolled down the aisle slowly. When it reached the CEO, he barely looked up from his screen. "Black coffee," he said, "and make it quick." The flight attendant handed it to him carefully. A small splash landed on the tray table during turbulence. It was barely noticeable, but the CEO frowned. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Is this the level of training now?" The attendant apologized softly and offered napkins. Back in row 14, the quiet man accepted a cup of water and thanked the attendant with a small smile. He asked how long she had been working that route. She seemed surprised by the question, but answered. They shared a brief, human moment in the middle of the sky. Later, as the cabin lights dimmed, the CEO stood up and walked toward the back, stretching his legs. He paused when he recognized the quiet man sitting by the window. "Still reading?" the CEO asked, glancing at the paperback. The quiet man nodded. "It helps pass the time." The CEO leaned against the empty aisle seat. "You know," he said, "people who want more out of life don't waste time staring out windows or reading novels. They build, they compete, they lead." His voice wasn't shouting. It didn't need to. The confidence in it was heavy. The quiet man closed his book slowly, placing a finger between the pages to keep his spot. "Everyone has their own path," he said. "That's what people say when they don't want to push harder," the CEO replied. He gave a tight smile and walked back to his seat. The quiet man looked out the window again. Outside, the world was dark and endless. Only a faint glow from the wing light broke the blackness. His reflection in the glass looked calm, but his eyes carried something deeper. Not anger, not shame, something older than that. A passenger across the aisle had heard everything. She looked at him carefully, as if trying to understand why he hadn't defended himself more strongly. But he simply reopened his book and continued reading. Hours earlier at the gate, he had received a message on his phone. It was brief, just a reminder about someone waiting for him at home. Someone who believed in him, not because of titles or wealth, but because of who he was when no one was watching. The plane cruised steadily at 30,000 feet. Most passengers had settled into silence. Some slept, some watched movies. The CEO typed aggressively on his keyboard, pausing only to check emails. In the middle of the cabin, the quiet man closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. The steady hum of the engines, the rhythm of the aircraft moving through air. His breathing matched it without effort. From a distance, he looked like any other traveler on a late evening flight. No one would guess there was more to his story. No one would guess how much he understood about responsibility, pressure, or the thin line between calm and chaos. Up front, the CEO finally leaned back in his seat, satisfied after sending one last email. He glanced down the aisle briefly, his expression unreadable. For now, the balance of power seemed clear. One man had status, wealth, and a loud voice. The other had silence. But high above the clouds, in the quiet darkness where no one truly controls anything, fate was already moving in ways none of them could see. The cabin grew quieter as the flight moved deeper into the night. The lights above the seats dimmed to a soft blue, the kind meant to calm people and help them sleep. The steady sound of the engines blended with the occasional cough, the rustle of a blanket, or the tap of fingers on a screen. Outside the windows, there was nothing but darkness and clouds far below. The quiet man remained awake. He wasn't restless, but sleep didn't come easily to him on planes. He kept his book open on his lap. Though he hadn't turned a page in a while, his thoughts drifted, not to the words on the paper, but to moments from long ago that still lived clearly in his mind. He remembered early mornings when the sky was still pale and silent, the weight of responsibility before the day even began, the sound of boots on concrete, the feeling of pressure, not just in the air, but in every decision. Mistakes were not small things back then. They carried consequences that stayed with you. A sudden laugh broke the quiet. The CEO was speaking again, this time to the man seated next to him. His voice was confident, relaxed, almost playful. He was telling a story about a young employee who had made a costly mistake. "I told him straight," the CEO said, loud enough for several rows to hear. If you can't handle pressure, you don't belong near important work. This isn't a place for weak people. The man beside him nodded, smiling politely, though his eyes showed discomfort. Pressure, the quiet man thought. Everyone thought they understood pressure. Deadlines, money, reputation. He knew another kind. The kind where there was no redo button. The kind where lives depended on calm hands and clear thinking. The flight attendant passed by, collecting empty cups. She paused when the CEO waved her over. "Can you lower the temperature a bit?" he asked. "It's warm back here." She checked her panel and explained gently that the temperature was controlled centrally. The CEO sighed. Figures. Nothing ever works quite right unless you're the one in charge. She smiled politely and moved on. In row 14, the quiet man stretched his legs slightly and adjusted his seat. The passenger across the aisle leaned toward him. "You handled that well earlier," she said softly, nodding toward the front. He looked at her, surprised. "Handled what?" She smiled faintly. "Some people talk down without realizing it. Not everyone can ignore that." He shrugged. "Words pass. They don't have to stay." She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if that answer told her something important. Minutes later, turbulence shook the plane lightly. The seatbelt sign flicked on. A few passengers gasped. Someone dropped the phone. The motion was brief, but enough to remind everyone that they were not in control. The quiet man placed his hand on the armrest without thinking. His fingers rested there naturally, steady. His breathing remained slow and even. The CEO stopped typing and looked up, irritated. "This is why I hate flying commercial," he muttered. "Too many variables." The turbulence passed, and the seatbelt sign turned off again. Conversation returned in small pockets throughout the cabin. As the flight continued, the quiet man's thoughts returned to the past. He remembered sitting in confined spaces, listening to alarms and instructions, knowing that fear was useless. Calm was a choice. Panic was a decision you could not afford. He had learned long ago that silence could be a strength, that you didn't need to explain yourself to everyone, especially not to those who only listen for their own voice. Up front, the CEO closed his laptop and rubbed his eyes. For the first time since boarding, he seemed tired. The confident posture softened. The sharp edge dulled slightly. He looked around the cabin, taking in the sleeping passengers, the dim lights, the sense of shared vulnerability that came with being sealed inside a metal tube miles above the ground. His gaze drifted back toward the middle of the plane. He spotted the quiet man again, still awake, still calm. Strange, the CEO thought. Some people just float through life. He leaned back and closed his eyes, convinced he understood exactly who mattered and who didn't. Another announcement came over speakers, routine and calm. The captain updated everyone on the remaining flight time and expected weather on arrival. His voice was steady, professional. The quiet man listened carefully. He always listened to voices in charge. Tone mattered more than words. Something in the captain's voice caught his attention. Not fear, not panic, but strain. A slight tightness that most people would miss. The quiet man sat a little straighter. A few rows ahead, a child began to cry softly. A parent whispered reassurances. Life continued in small, ordinary ways. The CEO opened his eyes again and checked his watch. He muttered something about schedules and delays. The quiet man glanced toward the cockpit door. He had learned to trust instinct, especially when it came quietly instead of loudly. The plane remained steady, but the air felt different. Not dangerous. Not yet, just heavy with the sense that something unseen was shifting. The flight attendant walked briskly down the aisle, her expression focused. She spoke quietly into the phone near the galley, turning her body away from passengers. The quiet man noticed. Across the cabin, most people remained unaware. Headphones on, eyes closed, trust placed fully in the unseen hands guiding them through the sky. The CEO stood briefly to retrieve something from the overhead bin, then sat back down with a huff. "This better not turn into one of those long nights," he said to no one in particular. The quiet man returned his gaze to the window. The darkness outside was complete now. No lights, no landmarks, just endless space. He felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Not fear, readiness. He didn't know what was coming. He only knew that when moments mattered most, titles meant nothing. Voices meant nothing. Only action did. The engines hummed on, steady and strong, carrying them forward. For now, everything looked normal. But the quiet man had learned long ago that the most important moments often arrive without warning, disguised as ordinary minutes in the dark. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. There was no loud alarm, no sudden drop, just a small change in sound. The steady hum of the engine shifted, almost like a note played slightly off-key. Most passengers didn't notice. They were asleep, distracted, or lost in their own thoughts. The quiet man noticed. He opened his eyes fully and listened. Years of experience had trained him to sense small changes before they became big problems. His body reacted before his mind finished a thought. He sat upright, feet flat on the floor, hands relaxed but ready. A few moments later, the seatbelt sign lit up again. This time, it stayed on. The captain's voice came over the speakers. It was calm, but more controlled than before. Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a bit of rough air ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The message was simple, but the quiet man heard what was underneath it. The strain was clearer now. The plane shook lightly. Then again, the turbulence grew stronger than before. Overhead bins rattled. A few passengers woke suddenly. Someone gasped. A child began to cry louder this time. Up front, the CEO looked around, annoyed at first, then uneasy. He tightened his seatbelt and glanced toward the aisle. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "They should avoid this kind of weather." The turbulence didn't stop. It rolled to the cabin in uneven waves, like driving on a rough road that kept changing shape. Drinks spilled. A flight attendant stumbled, but caught herself. "Please stay seated," she said firmly, her voice raised just enough to be heard. The quiet man's eyes moved to the ceiling panels, then to the wings outside the window. He watched how the aircraft responded, how quickly it corrected itself. Another announcement came, this time shorter. "Cabin crew, please take your seats." That message landed differently. The flight attendants quickly secured the cart and strapped themselves into nearby jump seats. Their faces were calm but focused, trained. The CO swallowed. He had flown many times, but something about this felt different. The movement was sharper now, less predictable. The lights flickered briefly. Just once. A ripple of fear moved through the cabin. The quiet man closed his eyes for a second, not to escape, but to center himself. He slowed his breathing, letting habit take over. Panic wasted energy. Focus saved it. Then came the announcement that changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, and this time there was no hiding the tension. "We are experiencing a technical situation. We are handling it, but we need everyone to remain calm and seated." The words were careful, chosen. Whispers filled the cabin. Hands gripped armrests. People checked seatbelts again, even though they were already fastened. The CEO's face had gone pale. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight. His phone was forgotten in his lap. The plane dipped suddenly, not far, but enough to make stomachs rise and hearts race. A scream broke free from somewhere near the back. The quiet man opened his eyes and looked toward the cockpit door. He had heard that tone before, many years ago, in moments when plans stopped working and only training remained. Another voice came over the speakers, not the captain this time. It was a flight attendant. "If there is anyone on board with advanced flight experience, especially military or fighter pilot training, please make yourself known to the cabin crew immediately." For half a second, the cabin froze. Then confusion erupted. People looked around, unsure if they had heard correctly. Some laughed nervously. Others shook their heads. The CEO turned sharply in his seat. His eyes moved fast, searching faces. The confidence he carried earlier was gone. This was not a problem money could fix. No one stood up. The plane shook again, harder this time. Overhead lights flickered and stayed dimmer than before. The quiet man felt his heart rate increase, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the moment he had trained for, even though he had hoped never to face it again. He hesitated, not because he doubted his ability, but because stepping forward meant reopening a part of his life he had carefully closed. Another announcement followed quickly. We need assistance now. The quiet man unbuckled his seatbelt. The sound of the click was loud in his ears. He stood slowly, steadying himself as the plane moved beneath his feet. Nearby passengers stared at him, eyes wide with fear and hope mixed together. "I have experience," he said calmly to the nearest flight attendant. His voice was even, clear. She looked at him, searching his face for reassurance. "What kind of experience?" "Advanced flight training," he replied. "High-pressure situations." That was enough. She nodded and motioned toward the front. "This way, please." As he stepped into the aisle, the CEO saw him. Recognition flickered, followed by disbelief. The same man, the one he had spoken down to, the one he had judged without knowing anything about him. The CEO's mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. The quiet man walked forward, holding on to seat backs as the plane shook. He didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes. Passengers watched him pass like he was something unreal, a stranger stepping into danger, while everyone else stayed seated. At the cockpit door, a flight attendant knocked urgently. The door opened just enough for him to slip inside. The door closed behind him. Inside the cabin, time stretched thin. The CEO sat frozen, hands clenched together. For the first time in a long while, he felt small, powerless. He realized then how shallow his judgments had been, how easily he had measured worth by noise instead of substance. The plane continued forward through the dark, carried with it fear, hope, and the weight of lives placed in the hands of a man no one had noticed until now. Inside the cockpit, the air felt heavier than in the cabin, not because of fear, but because of responsibility. Screens glowed softly, filled with numbers and symbols that never stopped changing. Warning lights blinked, not all of them, but enough to demand attention. One pilot sat stiffly in his seat, breathing shallow and fast. Sweat dotted his forehead. The other seat was empty. The quiet man took in the scene in seconds. He didn't rush. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, calm was the first tool you reached for. "What's the situation?" he asked. The pilot swallowed. "We lost one system. Backup kicked in, but the response is delayed. I can fly it, but the workload is heavy. My partner became unwell suddenly." The quiet man nodded. He understood immediately. Too many tasks at once could overwhelm even skilled hands. "I can assist," he said. "You fly. I'll manage support and calls." The pilot looked at him closely. "You trained for this?" "Yes," the quiet man replied. "No stories. No titles. That was enough." He took the jump seat and secured himself. His eyes moved smoothly from one screen to another. His hands rested lightly, ready but controlled. "Talk me through what you've done so far," he said, as the pilot explained. The quiet man listened, filtering what mattered from what didn't. He offered short, clear suggestions. Adjustments, timing, breathing space. Outside the cockpit, the cabin felt the difference almost immediately. The plane still moved through rough air, but the motions became more deliberate, less chaotic. Passengers sensed it, even if they didn't understand why. Some stopped crying. Some loosened their grip on the armrests. In his seat, the CEO stared at the closed cockpit door. Every sound felt louder now, every vibration sharper. He replayed his words from earlier in his head. The tone, the dismissal, the way he had reduced a stranger to nothing. For the first time, there was no excuse to hide behind. In the cockpit, the quiet man focused on the present. The past stayed where it belonged. He spoke calmly into the headset, coordinating with air traffic control. His voice was steady, confident, precise. He didn't raise it. He didn't soften it. He trusted it. The pilot's breathing slowed. His hand steadied. "Okay," the pilot said quietly. That helped. They worked together. Two people who understood that ego had no place here. Only trust. Minutes passed. Then more. The aircraft leveled out slightly. The worst of the turbulence eased, though the situation was far from over. The quiet man noticed a small detail on one of the displays. A timing mismatch. Subtle but important. "Give it a moment before the next input," he said. "Let the system catch up." The pilot followed the instruction. The response improved. Down the cabin, a flight attendant made a quiet announcement, reassuring passengers that the situation was stabilizing. Her voice carried relief, but remained professional. The CEO leaned back slightly, realizing his shoulders had been locked tight for a long time. His heart still raced, but hope had found its way back in. He looked around at the other passengers. Ordinary people. People he had never noticed before. People whose lives were now tied together with his in a way no boardroom ever could match. In the cockpit, the quiet man allowed himself one deep breath. Not relief, focus renewed. The pilot glanced at him. "You've done this before?" "Yes," the quiet man said. "Recently?" "No." The answer carried weight, but no explanation followed. They received new instructions from control. A change in route, a safer path, an earlier descent. The quiet man relayed the information clearly, helping the pilot prioritize. "Okay," the pilot said again, more confident this time. "We can do this." Outside, the cabin lights brightened slightly. Not fully, just enough to feel human again. The quiet man knew the danger wasn't gone yet. Overconfidence was as dangerous as fear. He stayed alert, guiding, supporting, adjusting. Time moved strangely, fast and slow at once. In the cabin, the CEO finally bowed his head, not in prayer exactly, in humility, a feeling he rarely allowed himself. He understood now that leadership wasn't about being heard. It was about being useful when it mattered. Inside the cockpit, the quiet man stayed silent for a few seconds, listening to the plane, feeling its rhythm. It reminded him of another life, another sky. But this was now. These were the lives in front of him. The aircraft continued forward, steadier with every passing minute, guided not by ego or noise, but by calm hands and quiet strength. The plane began its descent slowly, almost carefully, like it understood what was at stake. The shaking had not completely stopped, but it was different now, controlled, intentional, the kind of movement that told trained minds things were finally lining up. Inside the cockpit, the quiet man remained focused. His eyes moved less now. He didn't need to search anymore. He had a clear picture of what the aircraft needed and when. "Descent path looks good," the pilot said, his voice steadier than it had been before. The quiet man nodded. "Maintain this pace. Don't rush it." They worked without unnecessary words. Each adjustment was small, precise, the kind that came from experience, not guesswork. In the cabin, passengers felt the change. Some looked at each other with cautious hope. Others wiped tears they hadn't realized were falling. A few people quietly held hands. The CEO sat upright now, eyes fixed forward, but his thoughts were far from the cockpit instruments or the runway ahead. He was thinking about himself, about how easily he had judged, about how confidently he had spoken, without knowing who he was speaking to. He remembered the quiet man's calm answers, his lack of defense, his silence. For the first time in a long time, the CEO felt something he couldn't buy or command. Gratitude. The landing announcement came softly, controlled. The captain's voice sounded stronger now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please remain seated." The quiet man allowed himself a small breath out. Not relief yet, just acknowledgement. The runway lights appeared to the front windows, stretching out like a promise. The aircraft aligned itself carefully. "Speed steady," the pilot said. "Good," the quiet man replied. "Stay with it." The wheels touched the ground with a firm but clean contact. Not perfect, but safe. The sound of the tires against the runway was loud, real, undeniable. A second later, applause broke out in the cabin. Not loud at first, then stronger, mixed with sobs, laughter, and whispered thanks. The plane slowed, rolling forward until it finally came to a stop. For a moment, no one moved. Then the captain spoke again. This time, there was no tension left in his voice. "We are safely on the ground. Thank you for your patience." The quiet man removed his headset and stood carefully. The pilot turned to him, eyes full of respect. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You already did," the quiet man replied. "You trusted me." They shared a brief nod. Nothing more was needed. When the quiet man stepped back into the cabin, every eye turned toward him. The applause grew louder. Some people stood. Others simply pressed their hands together in front of their faces. He raised one hand slightly, not to wave, but to gently ask for calm. "Everyone's safe," he said. "That's what matters." The flight attendants thanked him quietly as he passed. He returned to his seat and sat down like nothing extraordinary had happened. The CO stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He walked toward the middle of the cabin, stopping beside the quiet man. "I owe you an apology," the CEO said. His voice was low, honest. "For my words, for my attitude." The quiet man looked up at him. There was no anger in his eyes. No pride either. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Just remember what today showed you." The CEO nodded, swallowing hard. "I will." Passengers began to exit the plane. Some thanked the quiet man directly. Others simply smiled at him, their eyes saying enough. When the cabin was nearly empty, the quiet man stood, picked up his bag, and walked toward the exit. At the door, he paused for a moment, looking out at the solid ground beneath them. Another flight attendant thanked him again. "You save lives," she said. He shook his head gently. Everyone did their part. He stepped into the terminal and blended into the crowd, just another traveler returning to his life. Behind him, the CEO watched him disappear, realizing that true strength didn't need an audience. Some lessons arrive quietly. Others arrive at 30,000 feet. This one would stay forever.